What if I told you that the great Vikings never froze in their homes, even when the fjords were frozen over? It seems incredible that in the 8th, 11th centuries, without central heating and modern technology, it was possible to survive the Arctic winter in Scandinavia, Iceland, or Greenland. However, for a people whose lives were spent in the cold winds, harsh winters were not a deadly threat, but merely a familiar backdrop to everyday life. Their engineering minds were focused on taming the cold using the simplest and most accessible materials: earth, stone, and wood. This ancient secret lay not in the amount of fuel burned, but in architectural ingenuity and a special way of life. Watch the video to the end to learn how the ancient Scandinavians turned an ordinary longhouse into a perfect heat engine, in which every element worked for survival. Guess how long it took to create such a dwelling, capable of surviving a century of harsh winters? It is important to understand that the Vikings did not build their houses exclusively from wood, as is often shown in films, since wood was a valuable and limited resource in northern regions. The true strength of their dwellings lay in the use of earth and turf, which was the most accessible, effective, and reliable insulating material. The use of turf, or peat bricks, in the construction of a longhouse, known as a langhus, was the most ingenious adaptation to the harsh climate. First, a wooden or stone frame was erected, which served as the skeleton of the building and bore the main load of the massive roof. Then this frame was covered with thick blocks of turf cut directly from the ground, which were laid in several layers. The walls could be up to 1.5 meters thick, creating an impenetrable barrier against wind and cold. These walls essentially turned the house into part of the landscape, blending it with the surrounding nature. As the turf dried and compacted, it formed a durable, almost stone-like shell that perfectly retained the internal heat. In winter, when the temperature inside and outside differed greatly, the turf wall acted as a thermal accumulator. It slowly released the heat accumulated inside and did not let the icy air outside in. In addition, turf walls had the unique property of absorbing moisture, which helped maintain a relatively stable microclimate inside the room. This was critical for preserving food supplies and the wooden structures of the house itself. The Scandinavians knew that humidity was the enemy of heat and skillfully combated it with their unusual building material. In more wooded areas, such as Norway, thick log walls were used, but even there, the exterior surfaces were often covered with an additional layer of insulation to protect the wood from dampness and direct contact with the cold. Thus, regardless of the region, the principle always remained the same: multi-layered, massive, and airtight protection. Share your opinion in the comments. What do you think about this approach to construction? Could you live in a house built from earth and grass? And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on other historical investigations. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the Vikings heated their homes and what was the source of their life? The heart of any longhouse was the hearth, which was called langoldur, which translates as long fire. This element was not just a place for a fire, but the central axis of all life, around which the architecture, daily life, and social structure of the family and community were built. The hearth was located right in the middle of the main hall, stretched almost its entire length, and was lined with large stones that served as the main heat accumulator. The stones around the fire accumulated a huge amount of heat while the fire was burning and continued to slowly release it for many hours after the fire had died down. This ensured that the room was heated evenly even at night, when it was no longer necessary to maintain an active fire. Thus, the langoldur worked on the principle of modern heat-accumulating stoves, but in a much more primitive and massive design. The hearth itself was slightly recessed into the earthen floor and bordered by 2 rows of stone masonry, which served as a kind of safety barrier. This allowed the fire to be kept under control while at the same time using its surface for installing boilers and cooking food. The smoke from the hearth rose upwards, but its heat was used as efficiently as possible for heating. Life bustled around the langoldur. Not only was food prepared here, but ice was melted for water, clothes were dried after bad weather, long conversations were held, and crafts were made. It was this fire that was the source of light during the long polar nights, making the space of the house suitable for any activity. Wood was the main fuel, but in regions where forest was scarce, such as Iceland, peat was actively used for heating. Peat burned more slowly and produced less heat, but it could be stored in huge quantities and provided long-lasting, albeit moderate, combustion. What do you think was the biggest problem with using such an open fire inside the house? But knowing how a hearth works is only half the secret. Are you ready to find out how the Vikings dealt with smoke, since smoke from such a hearth could be a real threat? You will find the answer to this question in the next chapter. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of their house design, which was the Scandinavian skill in making doorways into real heat traps. The Vikings understood perfectly well that the main heat loss occurs through doors and windows, so there were very few of them, and they were designed as cleverly as possible. The entrance door to a longhouse was always very low and narrow, forcing everyone who entered to bend over significantly, and this was done on purpose. The low doorway minimized the surface area through which cold air could penetrate inside. More importantly, the threshold in the doors was very high. It was called a threshold beam and was designed to create an air cushion. This beam prevented cold air, which always accumulates near the floor, from entering the lower, most important area of the hall for heating. Thus, a person entering had to step over a high threshold, which physically complicated the passage of cold air. It was a real physical barrier that allowed the warm air inside, which, as we know, rises to be retained. The entrance itself often consisted not of a single door, but of a small vestibule or corridor that served as a buffer between the outside environment and the warm living space. Upon entering the vestibule, a person would close the first door before opening the second one, leading to the main hall, which prevented direct cross-ventilation and heat loss. The vestibule was also used to store wet outer clothing and shoes, preventing dampness from entering the main living area. It was a simple but ingenious invention that minimized heat loss during frequent entry and exit. Windows, if there were any at all, were small and located high under the roof, again to conserve heat. They were not covered with glass, but with thin plates of horn or treated fish bladder, which allowed a minimum of light to pass through while providing at least some insulation. Sometimes the windows were simply small openings that were plugged with a wooden stopper. Another thermal secret was that long Viking houses, especially in Iceland, were often built with curved walls. A curved wall has less surface area in contact with the outside air than a right angle, which reduced overall heat loss. This shape also increased the house's resistance to strong winds, which were common on the coast. If you are interested in the practical genius of the northern peoples, be sure to like this video right now to show your support. What if I showed you a time machine that would transport you to the cold wall of a Viking house? The secret to effective heat retention in a longhouse lay in the unique, multi-layered construction of the walls, which were not just a barrier, but a complex engineering pie. In regions with large amounts of forest, such as Sweden and Denmark, the walls could be made of logs, but even they had a special design to combat the cold. The inner part of the wall, facing the living space, was always made of wood and served not only as a support, but also as a smooth, clean surface. This wooden panel quickly heated up from the hearth and prevented moisture from penetrating into the room, which was important for the comfort of the inhabitants. An air gap was often left between this inner wall and the outer insulation, which was another primitive but effective thermal insulator. The outer layer, as we have already mentioned, consisted of tightly packed turf or earth mixed with stones. This massive layer acted as an inert mass that changed its temperature very slowly, smoothing out daily and seasonal fluctuations. Thus, even if there was an ice storm outside, the internal heat was retained. In particularly harsh climates, such as in Greenland settlements, the Vikings added additional material between the turf layers, such as dry seaweed, moss, or straw, which acted as insulation. These materials absorbed any remaining moisture and created another insulating barrier. The walls became incredibly thick, sometimes up to 2 meters at the base, and this was their main advantage. Building these walls was a long and laborious process that required not only physical strength, but also a deep understanding of the natural properties of the materials. Each block of turf had to be laid correctly to ensure the necessary density and tightness. A mistaken laying could lead to subsidence and the formation of gaps through which cold air would seep. The thick walls also gave the house unprecedented strength and resistance to storms and hurricanes, which often hit the northern shores. A Viking house was not just a dwelling, but a fortress protecting against all external threats, including the most powerful forces of nature. Protection from the wind was perhaps as important as protection from the cold. How do you think they managed to prevent these heavy, massive walls from collapsing, especially when the snow melted in the spring? But even the thickest walls are useless if the house does not have a reliable and functional window for smoke to escape. In the next chapter, we will talk about a unique ventilation and lighting system. Despite the presence of a central hearth, long Viking houses had virtually no windows as we understand them today, but they did have a special opening for smoke and light. This opening, located directly above the langheldur in the center of the roof, was called a lorry and was the only outlet for smoke. The lorry was a key element of the entire heating system of the house. In essence, the lorry was a simple chimney that allowed smoke from the hearth to rise vertically and leave the room. Since heat always rises, this chimney was located at the highest point of the hall, which contributed to natural draft. The smoke went out and the bulk of the warm air remained below where people lived. The absence of a complex system of chimneys in the walls had one important advantage. The entire interior surface of the house was heated by the smoke and heat from the hearth before the smoke escaped outside. This allowed every unit of heat to be used to the maximum before it was lost. It was an extremely practical solution, reflecting the principle of rational economy. The lorry was a square or rectangular opening that could be adjusted. Using a simple system of poles or ropes, it could be covered with a wooden lid to reduce heat loss in severe frost or bad weather. This adjustment was an important daily task, as an incorrectly closed hatch could quickly cool the entire house. In good weather, the lorry served as the only source of natural light. Daylight, which was so necessary in the dark interior of a longhouse, penetrated the room through the open hatch in the roof. This opening was a source of light, air, and a chimney at the same time, performing a triple function. Of course, this solution did not completely eliminate smoke. Longhouses were always a little smoky, and the inhabitants had to get used to it, but the main carbon monoxide and the densest smoke went outside. In addition, a small amount of smoke helped to preserve food, which was hung from the ceiling for smoking. The smoke that remained in the room accumulated under the roof itself, forming a smoky cloud above the inhabitants' heads. But thanks to the low ceilings and thick walls, it did not descend to the level of the people. This allowed people to breathe relatively clean air, while the entire upper volume of the house served as a heat reservoir. Thus, the lorry was an ingenious compromise between the need to remove smoke, obtain light, and critically preserve heat. This simple element was a symbol of the Vikings' adaptation to harsh living conditions, where absolute comfort had to be sacrificed for survival. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries because it concerns not so much architectural secrets as social lifestyle. One of the most powerful but invisible sources of heat in a longhouse was the family itself, or more precisely, the high density of living. The longhouse, or skali, was designed to house not only members of one family, but often several generations, as well as workers. Many bodies in a relatively small and airtight space generated a significant amount of heat. This heat was a constant and passive source of heating, complementing the heat from the hearth. The more people there were in the house, the less firewood had to be used to maintain a comfortable temperature. Wide wooden benches called sets were arranged around the central hearth. These benches were not only used for sitting during the day, but also as beds at night. Animal skins and thick woolen blankets were spread out on them, creating ideal conditions for sleeping. People slept very close to each other, which is called social heating. In extreme cold, this closeness was not so much a matter of comfort as a necessity. Sleeping close to each other allowed them to retain as much of their individual body heat as possible. It was a physiological solution to the problem of cold. In addition, there was always some kind of activity going on in the house. Forging, weaving, repairing equipment, which also generated metabolic heat. The movement, breathing, and heat exchange of many people turned the living area into a kind of biothermal reactor. The walls of the house, as we remember, were covered with a thick layer of turf, and the interior was lined with wood. The benches and beds were also made of wood, which was important because wood is a poor conductor of heat. This meant that the heat from the bodies did not escape into the walls but remained inside. How difficult do you think it was for so many people to live under one roof with such limited personal space? But the main source of passive heat was not only the family. In the next chapter, we will talk about a unique shared heating system that really saved lives. The most unusual and powerful source of passive heating for the living area of the house, the scaly, was its proximity to the room where most of the property and resources were kept. We are talking about the fehus, or barn, which was often attached to the living hall and shared a wall with it. This was a conscious architectural decision. The barn was located so that the heat generated by the metabolism of the livestock was transferred through the shared wall to the living hall. The shared wall between the scaly and the fehus was thick to prevent odors from penetrating, but it still conducted heat, creating a real thermal bridge. This heat was stable because the animals emitted it around the clock, regardless of the time of day or weather. It was an ingenious, albeit somewhat inconvenient, way to maintain a basic temperature in the house without having to burn extra fuel. On cold nights, when the fire in the hearth died down, the heat from the barn became critical to the family's survival. The architecture of the room was such that the floor in the barn was slightly lower than in the living room, which also contributed to better heat distribution. The heat rose and was evenly distributed along the interior wall. The rooms themselves were separated by a thick, often adobe or stone partition. It is important to note that the animals in the barn also benefited from this arrangement, as the shared wall with the heated hall kept them from freezing. It was a mutually beneficial coexistence, where people and their property helped each other survive the winter. Such a combined longhouse was common in regions with the harshest climates, where any additional source of heat was worth its weight in gold. It symbolized the unity of the household, where all resources and elements were linked in a single chain of survival. This thermal bridge with the farm area was perhaps the most striking demonstration of Viking engineering pragmatism. They used natural biological processes to solve complex climatic problems. In addition to thick walls and a hot hearth, the floor and foundation of the longhouse played a key role in heat conservation, acting as a huge heat accumulator. The Vikings did not build houses on stilts or high foundations, preferring semi-subterranean or earthen floors. This was another ingenious solution. In the north, where the ground freezes to a great depth, low foundations or semi-subterranean construction allowed the thermal inertia of the soil to be used. Even if the ground froze, it still provided better insulation than air. The soil, being massive, released cold very slowly, and the house retained its temperature longer. The floor in the living room was often earthen, compacted, and sometimes covered with a layer of sand or clay. Thick layers of dry straw or reeds were laid on top of it, which served several functions at once. This flooring was soft, warm, and served as an additional insulating layer. Most importantly, the earthen floor directly beneath the hearth absorbed heat while the fire was burning. The heat slowly penetrated the ground, and even after the fire died down, the floor began to release this heat back into the room. It acted like a huge radiator that heated up slowly and cooled down slowly. This thermal inertia of the soil was critical for maintaining a consistent temperature in the house throughout the night. Unlike air, which cools quickly, the soil could retain heat for many hours. In the morning, when the hearth was lit again, the house was not freezing cold and did not need to be heated from scratch. The foundation, which usually consisted of large boulders, also helped prevent moisture from penetrating under the walls of the house. which was important for keeping the turf dry and insulating. The foundation stones provided the necessary ventilation under the turf blocks, preventing rot. Thus, even the lowest, seemingly simplest element of the house, the floor and foundation, was part of a complex thermal management system. The Vikings knew how to use the properties of the most ordinary materials to achieve incredible energy efficiency. The only problem was that this straw flooring had to be replaced regularly because it absorbed moisture. But this was an inevitable part of winter life. On the other hand, dry straw, in addition to warmth, also provided extra softness underfoot. Unlike wooden floors, earthen floors were more fire-resistant, which was an undoubted advantage given the presence of a large open fire in the center of the room. This was an example of how practicality and safety were combined in a single architectural idea. Another key secret that allowed longhouses to retain heat was the construction of the roof, which was as massive and multi-layered as the walls. The roof was not a light wooden canopy, but a complex, heavy insulating layer capable of withstanding snowfalls and storm winds. The roof was based on a sturdy wooden frame consisting of beams and rafters, which had to withstand not only its own weight, but also the enormous mass of turf and snow. This was the most difficult engineering task in the construction of a longhouse, requiring the thickest and strongest logs. The first waterproof layer was laid on the wooden frame. Most often, birch bark was used for this purpose, which is a natural waterproofing material and does not allow water to pass through. Pieces of birch bark were laid overlapping to ensure complete water drainage and protection from moisture. On top of the birch bark came the second, thickest layer, turf, cut in the same way as for the walls. The turf blocks were laid in 2 or 3 layers, creating an incredibly thick insulating mat that prevented heat from escaping through the top. The turf roof had phenomenal thermal inertia. It was so thick and massive that even in severe frosts, the temperature on the inner surface of the turf remained relatively high. This reduced heat loss through the roof to an absolute minimum. In addition, grass often grew through the turf on the roof, and the root system bound it together, making the roof even more durable and resistant to erosion. The grass and moss that grew through it also served as additional insulation and helped the house blend in with the surrounding landscape. Maintaining such a roof required regular cleaning of excess snow and repairs, especially in the spring when the turf could settle or slide. It was constant work, but it provided many years of reliable protection from the elements. In addition to architectural and engineering solutions, the Vikings used their very lifestyle to maintain warmth and comfort in the home. Their daily habits and clothing were designed with the need to conserve every unit of heat in mind, which was part of their unwritten code of survival. Viking clothing was primarily layered and made of sheep's wool and skins. Wool, even when wet, retains heat, and layering allowed them to regulate their body temperature depending on their level of activity. By removing the top layer, they could avoid overheating while working and then quickly warm up again when resting. Their diet was rich in fats and proteins, which provided the body with enough energy to maintain a high internal temperature. Meat, fish, lard, and dairy products were the staples of their diet, and this diet was ideal for living in a cold climate. Fatty foods were a kind of internal fuel. Most activities not related to hunting or sea voyages took place inside the longhouse, which, as we have already mentioned, contributed to social heating. Crafts such as weaving, blacksmithing, wood carving, and repairs were carried out in the warmth, which maintained continuous heat exchange. Oil lamps were used for additional lighting and local heat. Animal fat or seal blubber burned slowly, giving off an even, albeit dim, light, while emitting a small but important amount of heat in close proximity to people. These lamps were often placed in corners where the light from the hearth did not reach. Thus, the Vikings survived the long Arctic winters thanks to a combination of 3 factors: ingenious passive architecture that used the earth as insulation, high social density, and a lifestyle geared toward efficient heat conservation. They did not fight nature, but worked with it in close alliance. We can see that the Vikings' survival in the Arctic winter was not a miracle. but the result of a deep understanding of physics and skill in using natural materials. Their longhouse was not just a primitive structure, but a complex, multifunctional heat engine. From the thick turf walls and massive roof to the central hearth and the use of heat from the utility area, each element worked toward a single goal: to preserve precious heat. Their success was based on the philosophy that it is better to prevent heat loss than to try to compensate for it. They turned the earth itself into an insulator and social crowding into an additional source of heating. This legacy teaches us that the most effective solutions are often the simplest and most natural ones, honed by centuries of practical experience. Which of the Vikings' engineering solutions, the use of turf walls, the thermal bridge with a barn, or the ingenious design of the lorry, do you find most remarkable? Share your opinion in the comments. We are very interested to hear your point of view. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research and discoveries about the lives of the great northern peoples.